put us in a box. Go ahead. That just gives us something to break out of. Because the next generation 2025 GMC Terrain Elevation is raising the standard of what comes standard. As far as expectations go, why meet them when you can shatter them? What we choose to challenge, we challenge completely. We are professional grade. Visit gmc.com to learn more.
In the time it takes us to say we're making a damn delicious caramelized coffee with Folgers Instant Coffee, you know we're all about that drizzle. You could be savoring every sip. Damn right. It's Folgers Instant.
This episode is brought to you by Espolón Tequila. Slow, sticky, snoozy. They call these the dog days of summer. But Espolón? They don't do boring. Welcome to the Marg Days. Espolón Tequila. 100% blue Weber agave, born to shake up your summer. Just add lime, agave, and a little attitude. Visit espolontequila.com. Espolón Tequila, 40% alcohol, volume 80 proof. Copyright 2025 Campari America, New York, New York. Drink responsibly.
Vladimir Putin is one of the most fascinating people of our times. For good or for bad, mostly for bad, he has held sway over much of the geopolitical issues that we've been facing in the 21st century. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host, and today, a look at Russia Under Putin. That is, in fact, the name of a book that is edited by academic Andrew Natsios. He brought together a series of people who are experts in the area to write essays about the Russian leader and his impact, a leader that Stephen Harper, at a recent conference in Saskatchewan, referred to as a Bond villain.
Vladimir Putin is a real-life Bond villain. Like, he really is.
Now, calling Putin a Bond villain is funny, but it's also a bit of a caricature. How should we in the West look at him? There are far too many people, in my view, that view Putin as a savior, someone who is standing up for Western values or traditional families. That's not the case, says Andrew Natsios. Here is our conversation. So, Professor Natsios, you've edited this book, you've contributed to it. Let me ask you off the top, what should the average Westerner think about Vladimir Putin? There's a lot of opinions that make him out to be a boogeyman, a lot of opinions that make him look out to be a defender of Christian Western culture. And where do you fall at the end of all of this?
Well, just to clarify, I am not in the left. I'm right of center, not far, not a populist, traditional Republican. Two, I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I am certainly not hostile to the Orthodox Church. I'm very serious about my faith. So it pains me to say this, but I think he's used the church to appeal to Westerners. According to the website of the Russian government, 2% of Russians go to church. If you look in Greece, it's 60% of the population goes to church. So the Russians are not churchgoers. And I think the reason is because Putin has used the church and people have been quite cynical about the hierarchy because they go out and bless tanks and missiles and stuff like that, which I think is extraordinarily inappropriate. But what to think of him? He is a traditional Russian autocrat. Stephen Kotkin is the biographer of Joseph Stalin. He's working on the third volume of each volume is 900 pages long. It's the definitive study of Stalin. And he was asked to comment on who Putin was and why Putin invaded Ukraine. And he said, he is just in a long line of Russian autocrats that go back to the 19th century. This has nothing to do with NATO. It has to do with the Russian Empire, which he is attempting to reconstruct. And he has a big problem on his hands, which I describe in the book and through my chapter, which is the demography of Russia is a catastrophe. Now, all advanced countries.
Just before you go on, in what ways do you mean that?
Well, the population's in decline. And it's true that fertility rates across the world are in decline, particularly in the industrialized country. In fact, everywhere in the world except Africa, the fertility rates are in decline. We are now in the United States, and I think in Canada as well below what's called population stability, which is an average of 2.1 children.
Oh, we are well below that in Canada, and you're higher than us, but still below.
And we're making it worse by making this an uncomfortable place for immigrants because that's what's saving us. It's saving Canada and the United States to have immigrants. That's another subject. But Western Europe has the same problem. That's not just that's not the only problem Russia has. It's people don't live as long. The men die 10 years earlier because the suicide rate, the drug addiction rate, the alcoholism rate, the accident rate in Russia is, and the cardiovascular disease rate in Russia is astronomically high. The life expectancy in Russia is the highest for an advanced industrial educated society in history. There's a whole chapter in the book by um, a demographer at the American Enterprise Institute, who's one of the experts on the subject, Nick Eberstadt. And my essay is an extension of his. His just focuses on the demography. My question is that I look at is that affecting Russian foreign policy? The answer is most definitely, because Putin is obsessed with it. I don't know why scholars haven't noticed this before, but Putin, like other Western leaders, gives an annual address to what he calls the National Security Council, and it's all of the Soloviki, the intelligence services, of which there are 17 or 18 in the Russian system. And it goes through what he thinks are the big issues of the day, and it's not private. I mean, it's publicized. You can get the transcript of what he said, and his position has evolved over since he became president 25 years ago. On this issue of population. At the beginning, he talked about it as a serious problem. It's an economic problem, a military problem, and what he calls it a humanitarian problem. The closer they got to the first invasion of Ukraine, the more apocalyptic language he uses. And then just before the second invasion, he says 40% of his speech is on this issue of demography, of the collapse of Russia. One Russian demographer at Moscow State University estimates that by the end of this century, Russia will decline from 145 million people to 70 million people. This is
By the end of this century.
the end of this century. That is astonishing. That it means it'll basically be the largest country in the world by far geographically that's empty. They're predicting that Siberia will go from 40 million to 20 million. And Siberia contains 2/3 of the mineral and oil and gas wealth of the entire planet.
So
And there's not going to be anyone there.
look, part of the reason Russia was able to take over Siberia, because it wasn't originally part of it, was because it was empty. And it's
Right.
going to be empty again, which means somebody else could take it over.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, the Russian intellectuals quietly, and some of the intelligence services are saying the West is not our enemy. We should not be pursuing this war in Ukraine. The risk to Russia is China. China, also is losing population, but they have 1.4 billion people, and they're pressing on that. Russia almost went to war with China in the 1960s, as you may know. They have a very long and contested border with China, and that's where he should be focusing his attention. But it's not. He's made this supposed alliance with Xi Jinping, but the reality is below that level of senior leadership, there's a lot of animosity between the Chinese and the Russian elites. The Chinese elites look down at the Russians as basically a corrupt dictatorship. China is a dictatorship, but they've been putting corrupt people in jail. Russia doesn't do that.
I'm sorry for laughing at that, but we're talking. Folks are debating which level of dictatorship is worse. Before we get too much deeper into the book, I want to thank you for raising what you did right off the top about the way that Putin has used the Russian Orthodox Church and his supposed defenses of things like traditional family. I've heard from so many young men one of my own sons included, about, oh, well, Putin is standing up for what matters. And it's like, no, no, I think he's using and abusing that. And he really has on so many fronts, and yet he's got a following in Western society as a result of his posturing, doesn't he?
Oh, he most definitely does. And I hear this from people who don't know a lot about what's actually happening. Look at the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. He's a tobacco merchant. He's making millions of dollars in a tobacco a monopoly. Look at their photographs with him with a $50,000 watch in his arm. I mean, the hierarchs in the Orthodox Church are supposed to be celibate and live lives of poverty. He is not doing that. And there's a huge war now between the patriarch of the entire Orthodox Church, Bartholomew, whose seat is in Istanbul, uh, and the patriarch in Moscow, and they are at war with each other rhetorically, because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church had been under Moscow, and the Bartholomew gave, and he has the authority under canon law to do that. He gave Ukraine independence from Russia, and the Russian Orthodox Church is very hollow. And as a result, there's this war. They condemn each other in the liturgy on Sunday. So I don't think we condemn him, but he condemns us. So I think they're making a big mistake. They're believing the propaganda that Russia is an Orthodox country. 2% of the people go to church. Let's say that's not an Orthodox country.
Now, what about the domestic politics? Yeah, I used to work with a camera operator when I was in the TV business, who would describe what it was like going back to visit his family in Russia. And, as someone who had left Russia, come to Canada for reasons because he, did not like his economic opportunities there, but also because he didn't like the oppression. And he could see it from the outside, but he would go back to Russia and his family would just tell him how great Putin was. There is, I mean, he has a stranglehold over not only how the legislature works out of the Kremlin, but over the media, and a lot of the public still buys into what he's selling, don't they?
Well, that's because he's destroyed an independent media. Almost all Russians, or I shouldn't say all Russians, 90% of Russians, the non intelligentsia, get their news from the electronic media, which is true in the West as well. And he has basically taken over all the electronic news media, and they feed them propaganda. And the most damaging thing that happened is when this, I think it was under President Obama, or I can't remember which president, but the CIA released a photograph of this massive palace that was built on the Crimea for Putin. And it's hundreds of millions of dollars to build this. They just showed a photograph of it and released it. It caused widespread anger in Russia because it was not released in the news stations, but virtually through the internet. And the younger people, by the way, hate Putin in the polling data. He has a 20% approval rating of people under 30 years old in Russia. He might have he used to have an 80% approval rating for older people, but that is now in decline because the casualty rates are so high in Russia from the war in Ukraine, and the abuse and the repression is so bad that he's losing that support. And they are now tightening up on any information. We
So
used to get a lot of data.
is this kind of like his Vietnam, to put it in an American
Yeah.
context?
Oh, yes, it is absolutely. And the reason he's increasing the repression is the elites, the Soloviki, which is the term for all these intelligence services, are all saying, "Why you keep pursuing this? This is disastrous for us. We are not winning this war. We're doing a lot of damage to the Ukraine, but we've made the Ukraine into a permanent enemy of Russia." And now, when Westerners say, well, they're one country, they're not one country. They're two different countries, and their languages are similar, but Spanish is similar to Portuguese, but they're two different countries. You never tell a Spaniard or a Portuguese that they're the same country. The Ukraine, part of Ukraine, East Ukraine.
Try going to Glasgow and telling someone that they're English.
I know
Same
exactly.
thing.
So, exactly. But the thing is that Eastern Ukraine used to be more oriented toward the east, toward Moscow, and Western Ukraine was more oriented toward Europe. That is no longer the case. Putin maybe has about 6%, 7% of the population, Ukraine, that remains pro-Russian, but the rest of the population now absolutely hates the Russians. And I point out to people, they don't realize what the Russians did to the Ukrainians in the 1930s during the forced collectivization. They killed through starvation, Stalin did, 3 to 4 million Ukrainians. It's one of the horrendous, it's the worst famine in Europe in the century and a half. And it was orchestrated out of Moscow. And they deliberately exterminated the Orthodox Church leadership, the cultural leadership of the country, the intellectual leadership, the universities. They targeted them for starvation to kill off the leadership of Ukrainian society so that Stalin could have his way with the forced collectivization. And we know now from the records of the Russian archives, they did it deliberately. We know now from Stalin actually admitted he knew what was going on. He said, let them die. So there's a lot of Ukrainians that say, we remember what happened during the 30s. We don't trust the Russians and we don't want them running the country.
But you say that he has, Eastern Ukraine was more aligned with Russia. He's alienated them. And then within Russia, uh, your book points out that he launched this war in part. Uh, we've seen this in movies. We've talked about it. Wag the dog or whatever you want to talk about, where leaders will launch wars or conflicts to try and bolster domestic support. That's no longer the case in Russia, though, you're saying.
No, it's changed because of the level of casualties, as it did during the Afghan war when Russia invaded Afghanistan. They lost far fewer people. But the interesting thing is who is dying in the war. While Russian troops are dying, the Ukrainians are killing a lot of Russian generals and senior officers. They have evolved into the strongest military in Europe now. So what's
The
happening?
Ukrainians have evolved into that?
Oh, yes. Their military is one of the strongest militaries in Europe now. And it's because they realize if they lose this war and Russia takes over the Ukraine, I point out in my chapter that they're likely to start resettling the population to demolish Ukraine as a society. They've already done that in the areas they've conquered. They've moved, according to the minister of who I knew Shoigu. He's been removed since a defense minister, but he was head of their FEMA, their emergency management agency, 35 years ago. And they came to the United States, and I had a dinner for them at my house when I was the head of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in USAID. And he was in the delegation. He was in his late 30s. So he was very quiet, but he later became defense minister for much of the early part of this war. Shoigu said publicly in a press statement that they've moved 1.37 million Ukrainians out of the conquered area into Siberia or into the Ural Mountains. Some of them, according to Human Rights Watch, have been moved to the Sakhalin Islands in the Pacific. It is outrageous. You look at the UN reports on this. There's also a Yale Observatory on armed conflict, and they're reporting the same thing. Hundreds of thousands of children who are really not orphaned are being moved into Siberia to repopulate that area.
We've got protest after protest about the idea that, in the war between Hamas and Israel, that people would be moved or that populations would be shifted. And the entire world is upset about that. But it's actually happening between Russia and Ukraine, and I hear crickets.
You're absolutely right. Now, the U.S. ambassador under Biden to the UN, she brought it up, and the Secretary of State brought it up, and it was on the State Department website. It's been since taken down, but it's not a secret. It's just no one said anything about it. Stalin did the same thing, by the way, in the late 1930s. You know, the Greeks, and I'm a Greek American, uh, have been in the Crimea since 700 BC. He moved all the Greeks out because he was suspicious of them. He moved the Tartars out, who had been there since 1300, and moved them to what's now Kazakhstan. Hundreds of thousands of these ethnic groups that Stalin moved or died during the transport. They were just dumped. And Putin's doing the same thing Stalin did. And again, the world is not saying anything about it. So I think what's going to happen, if they lose, they know Ukraine will cease to exist. And if you talk to the Poles, we have delegations at the Bush School at Texas A&M where I teach, and we hear that these are Polish intellectuals, they're city councilors, there's mayors, they're parliamentarians. They think they're going to be next. The Baltic states are arming now, and the interesting thing is that Finland has now withdrawn from the landmines convention because they're mining the whole 800-mile border with Russia. The Swedes are in war mode now. They're actually doing exercises in the schools for air raid drills to prepare people for a war. So Europe now realize the Germans finally have woken up and are beginning to arm. But I think this is exactly the opposite of what Putin intended. He thought he was going to go in, just take things over, and he'd be welcomed as a hero and all this. And that's not what's happened. So he's dug himself into a hole and does not know how to get out of it. And I think he's in a dictatorship. You know, you make up your own reality.
We've had Canadian forces in Latvia, and I believe perhaps Lithuania as well, for about a decade now, as part of Operation Reassurance, just trying to say, yeah,
Exactly.
we've got your back, because we all believe, anybody that's looking at this objectively believes that Vladimir Putin wants to get the band back together. He wants the old Russian Empire to be resurrected.
Yes, he does. That's exactly right. And we have a chapter in the book by Jim Coram, who was he's an American. He served with me in the Army Reserves. I think we were in the Gulf War together. He was a colonel. I was lieutenant colonel. And I was a civil affairs officer, interestingly enough. But he was the dean of the equivalent of our West Point, our senior Army school in the United States for our senior officers in the Baltic states. And he wrote a chapter on that experience and whether or not the Baltic republics are at risk, because they know they are. And then his wife, Lynn Coram, translated four books, I think, called Project Russia, which is very disturbing to read because it is a best-selling book. It sold 2 million copies in Russia. It's the closest thing we have to an ideology for the Russian regime. I had a student who wrote and translated Russian fluently one summer, translated the whole thing for me. He said, "This is really weird to read this stuff because it's all into conspiracy theories, how the West has designed this whole effort to destroy Russian culture." We spent, Canada, the United States, Western Europe, a fortune, billions of dollars trying to reconstruct Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We helped them enter the international economy and the other European countries, Eastern European countries that became liberated from Russia. In Eastern Europe, it worked. It didn't work in Russia because of the level of corruption and the fact that the KGB basically took control of the country politically. And that's the other thing that we pointed out in the chapter. Anders Aslan is a Swedish development economist who's the expert in Russian corruption. He has a whole chapter on the circles around Putin. There are 3 levels of circles of people who run the country, who looted the economy. Putin himself was worth about $125 billion, according to his Andrew's calculations. He's at the Atlantic Council, but he has written widely on this subject. There's the first chapter of the book by she's a professor at Stanford, and she is an expert in Catherine Stoner on the Russian political system, and she's pointed out that essentially the KGB, the old secret police, now called the FSB, have politically taken over, and economically taken over both the economy and the political system and run it into the ground. It's not just a matter of a concentration of wealth. In the West, in Canada, the United States, Europe, we have billionaires, but they've created something. Bill Gates created Microsoft.
They build businesses.
These guys didn't create anything. They looted something.
They create jobs. They create wealth for the rest of us.
Exactly.
I'm sure there's going to be somebody screaming that, oh, well, you're just a chattel. Why would you ever believe that? But no, they do create jobs. In Russia, it's very different. One of the things I love about your book, Professor Natsios, is that it is a bunch of chapters written by different people. When we come back, we have to take a quick break now. But when we come back, I do want to talk about your chapter on the West misreading Putin's intentions and what he's trying to do. Back in moments.
This episode is brought to you by Nordstrom. Summer's almost out and fall's calling. Luckily, Nordstrom has everything you need for the season ahead, all under $100. Discover new arrivals from your favorite brands like Mango, Princess Polly, Wave, Free People, BDG, and more. Whether you're planning a last-minute getaway, heading back to class, or refreshing your office looks, you'll find the latest trends and beauty must-haves without breaking your budget. It's easy, too, with free shipping, free returns, and in-store order pickup. Shop today, in stores, and at Nordstrom.com.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Stuck in a lo-fi loop again? Hit shuffle and refresh the everyday with Mentos Gum. Pop a piece and turn that sleepy soundscape into a dance floor. Freshen up your moves with spearmint. Find freedom with fresh mint. Get juicy with red fruit lime and tropical. Or choose a different way to refresh the everyday with your favorite. Mentos Gum. Yes to fresh.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
So, Professor Natsios, I think back to when the Berlin Wall fell, when the Iron Curtain fell, when we were expecting glasnost for people that remember that term, and we suddenly fell away from that. We went from Boris Yeltsin, for all his faults, showing up in Washington, showing up in Ottawa. He was a great friend of Brian Mulroney, our late former prime minister, would show up and regale him with stories. They were very close. And then we go from that to Stephen Harper, Canada's former prime minister, showing up shortly at a G8 meeting shortly after the invasion of Crimea, saying, I only have one thing to say to you, and that is get out of this country, get out of Crimea. How did we go from things are opening up to we're shutting down relations with Russia?
I think that Putin bided his time when he first took over. He took over. He was not expecting to be the head of state of Russia. This happened very quickly. He had been involved actually with the mafia in St. Petersburg in one of the most corrupt governments in the country. And then he went to Moscow.
Hold on. Hold on. I've got to pause you there. Explain that because I think a lot of our listeners will not know that and will
Okay.
not know anything about it. So,
Yeah.
expand on that just for a minute or two.
He was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, the secret police in East Germany, and he went from there back to Russia, and he got a job as one of the deputy mayors in St. Petersburg, the second largest city, cultural capital of Russia in many respects. And the evidence from some of the reformers in Russia is he got involved with the criminal mafia in the city. And he moved from there to Moscow, and he was known for being very efficient and fanatically loyal to his bosses. And he was briefly put in charge of the new KGB called the FSB, I think for just 8 or 10 months. And then he went on to other positions. And then finally, Yeltsin chose him to be his successor, just like that. I mean, no one was expecting, no one even knew who he was. And for the first 10 years, he was seen as a reformer. If you read his PhD dissertation, which some people say he didn't actually write, he hired someone to write it. It was a classical liberal document about joining the Western democracies in terms of market economy.
There was a lot of optimism about him.
I think what happened is he realized that communism had done enormous damage to Russia because it had been in place since 1917. Eastern European communism wasn't as deep because, for example, there was no collective farming system in Poland. They did not collectivize the farms the way they did in Russia. And the Eastern European communism was resisted on a massive scale by the Solidarity Union in Poland and the Catholic Church. And so there was a lot of nationalism. That was not true in the Soviet Union as much. And so I think it did more damage. And what happened is the chaos of the 1990s, because there was massive economic chaos in the transition to a capitalist economy, or supposedly a free market economy, and people's pensions weren't being paid. There was a lot of suffering, economic suffering in Russia. And he was brought in to reconstitute the Russian state, which had collapsed as an apparatus of governance. And he did that by basically seizing control of all of the natural resources of the country, particularly oil and gas, and giving them out, control of these resources, to former KGB agents. In fact, there are a number of studies have been done showing that a large percentage of the people running Russia now in all of the major institutions are former KGB agents, and who are colleagues of Russia. Many of them were generals in the KGB, and they converted, became business people. They're not really business people; they're looters, but that's what they did. And I think at the beginning, in the 1990s, these people were basically telling the government what to do, and Putin said, "No more of this." So he started arresting them, and some of them had accidents and died, and eventually
falling out of windows or running into umbrellas.
By the way, that's what's happening now. That I think it was the Minister of Transport just supposedly committed suicide just before he was arrested for corruption, and he didn't commit suicide. And there a lot of the oligarchs who are opposed to what he's doing in Ukraine are falling out of windows, as you point out. So some people are comparing this on a much smaller scale to Stalin's purges in the late 1930s to suppress any dissent within the ruling elite. But what Putin did eventually was seize control from these oligarchs who had taken control of the economy. He arrested them, forced them out of the country, confiscated their wealth, put them in jail, taxed them to death where they had accidents. And then he gave it to a network of people he created, all this wealth, of people who were loyal to him. Catherine Stoner says in her chapter that this is basically what is called a clientelist state or a patrimonial state, which is a complex set of personal relationships, because the institutions of Russia are so weak that it's all based on personal connections. The reason the West is relatively stable economically and politically, despite all our problems, we have an orderly system for deciding who governs over a couple of centuries. And that is not the case in Russia. When Putin dies, no one really knows who's going to take over. The process in the Constitution is probably not going to be followed. And there's going to be a period of chaos and instability because all regimes change because all people eventually die. And so their system is fragile in a political sense. And that is its great weakness. The institutions are corrupted or they're very weak. And Russia could fly apart. And that's what people are afraid of. It would be a disaster because they have nuclear weapons, they have biological weapons. And we don't want Russia descending into chaos because if it does, it will be a disaster for the whole world. But that could happen. Could happen.
So, how did the West so badly misread Putin? Um, not to pump Stephen Harper's tires, but Harper read it pretty quickly, and sitting in a room with news conference with both Obama and Harper, and Harper just seemed to have the ability to look at what other world leaders were doing and assess it quickly that Obama didn't have. And so, some of this happened under Obama, but it also happened under Trump. It's happened under Biden, and now we're into Trump 2.0.
You're absolutely right.
How
I think. How did it happen? I think some Western political leaders in all of our countries were living in or hoping for a new Russia, hoping for a Russia that looked more like Europe, Canada, or the United States, or other industrialized democracies, when in fact the opposite was happening. And I think it was just naivete. If you look at the academic literature during this period, many of the scholars of Russia were dismissing. I had arguments with some of them who knew far more about Russia than I did, and they would sit and say, "Oh no, Putin's a pragmatist. He's moving the country." This was relatively 10 years ago that they were saying this. I said, "That's complete nonsense. Look at what he's actually doing. He's destroying civil society. The Duma has become a rubber stamp. The Russian Orthodox Church is simply an appendage of the government." And the news media is being shut down, particularly the electronic news media, and they're using propaganda to mislead the public as to what's really going on. The interesting thing is,
but I mean, I was seeing this 15 years ago as a general observer. How did the academics and the think tanks and the bureaucrats not see this?
I think it's naiveness. Mike McFaul was the ambassador to Russia, I think, under Obama or Biden. He was a professor at Stanford, and when he left to go to Russia to be ambassador, he was much more naive. When he came back, he was quite militant and hostile to Putin because he said he's not what we all thought. So McFaul, you can see a change in McFaul's attitude once he went to Moscow to be ambassador, and he's written about this widely. And I mean, he's a Russia scholar. So they're all, most of them are admitting now they made a mistake. The problem is some people are blaming the West, which I listen to all the time. I'm fed up with listening to it. Stephen Kotkin says this is nonsense to blame the West for what happened. This is Russian autocracy from the 19th century reemerging in a modern form. That's what this is. And unless we stop them, he's just gonna keep going. The notion that he's going to stop with Ukraine is naive. We heard this once before in the 1930s with someone else. I don't want to start drawing some parallels, but the interesting thing is Putin, when he's on the air, he goes on the air all the time, or he used to before the war. He used to quote a guy named Ivan Ilyin, who was one of his favorite thinkers. Ilyin even was a Russian Nazi. In the 1920s, he left Russia and went to Europe and lives in Switzerland. He was a voluminous writer. He embraced Mussolini, and then eventually worked in Goebbels' propaganda ministry in the Nazi Reich in Berlin. he died eventually, and Putin had his remains brought back to Moscow and reburied with an Orthodox bishop standing there. This is this is uh, not a neo-Nazi, a Nazi.
What are the chances that Vladimir Putin believes anything the Orthodox Church says?
I think that he's quite doing. He goes to Mount Athos, which is the monastic center of Orthodox Christianity, and he prostrates himself in front of the icons. And they do this on TV all the time. I used to be taken 20 years ago when I saw this, and I said to some of my Greek friends, I said, "Look, he's one of us." He said, "No, he's not, Andrew. You guys in America are so naive." And eventually, I remember these business people telling me, said, "Don't be taken in by this guy. He's not what he appears to be." I think the Europeans are a little bit more realistic sometimes than the Europeans and Americans and Australians, who are they want to believe better things of other leaders, and so they get taken in sometimes. And Harper was not one of the people that got taken.
I will say this as someone who has spent time in Eucharistic adoration, who has prostrated themselves before the real presence, all of that. And this is a ruse. This, I don't believe anything he's saying about this.
I don't either. I no one who any form of Christianity go through the slaughter he has presided over and the human rights atrocities.
Yes.
I mean, the execution of children in point blank range and in Bucha in Ukraine. And then it's one thing to have soldiers out of control. That happens in wars. I understand it. He gave awards to all the soldiers that killed those children.
Andrew, I want to ask you about this. You said at the start that you are from the right, you are from the conservative side, as am I. But there are some people on our side who want to believe everything that Russia and Putin put up there. And it's not just Tucker Carlson. This is a real movement within the right in North America that I don't understand. I've been trying to, and I don't understand it. Do you?
Well, I'll tell you, my church, the Orthodox Church, I was a Protestant for much of my life. 25 years ago, I went back to the Orthodox Church that I was in. I had been a Presbyterian that I was baptized in. And, we have a little church in the city in Texas that I live in. And it's, we had, 50 people. We now have 150 people in the church, and it's mostly young men. And I've gone up to them and said, and these are not ethnic Russian or Greek or Romanian people whose family, these are mostly Baptists. They come from evangelical backgrounds. And and I thought this was just our church. It's happening across the country. And I asked them, why are you joining our church? We're welcoming you. We're so happy. He said, we need to reach back to the past, which the Orthodox Church embraces, because we don't trust anything in the modern world. We don't think it's genuine. And we want a world from the 3rd century, which is what the Orthodox Church is in some way. But the disciplines, you have to, in my church, you have to stand up for 2 hours, and there's severe fasting. That's not very modern.
Yeah, well, like as a Catholic, I'm looking at our stand up, kneel down, and that's bad enough. And then you guys are worse.
Yes, we are worse. And the fasting, you used to do the fasting, and then Vatican II said not so much anymore. Our fasting regime is like 5 months out of the year. We have a vegan fast, essentially. But anyway, I said, are you attracted to this? He said, yes, because it's hard. We want something that's hard. And Putin has convinced everyone that the answer to the West's ills is to go back to the ancient church. Well, the problem is he's not following the ancient church. And the regime is so corrupt, and the violence, the abuse in the regime is so horrible, even before the invasion of Ukraine, that it's not believable. They're using the church for their own purposes, and I find it contemptible myself.
Where do we go from here in terms of trying to push back against Putin in the West? Because, as we've discussed, there's a bunch of young men who think that this is the answer. You and I would argue that, clearly it's not. But how do we push back against that and say, look, this guy is not who you think he is?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing is we have to make sure that Ukraine doesn't fall, because I am certain they're going to go after Moldova, the Baltic states, Poland, and who knows, they're threatening Finland now and Sweden for joining NATO. So I think we're going to have a European war in hand. We already have one. I think it's the early stages of another European war. The way to deal with this is through properly arming the Ukrainians, despite the weaknesses in their government and corruption and all that. The Ukrainian military is making a very, very strong effort to defend the country, and we need to support them. And this it's not naive. This U.S. change of policy every 2 weeks is, I think, disastrous. We need to take a firm stance. Most of the Republicans in the Congress.
What do you mean by that? This change of policy every 2 weeks?
The president 1 week wants to make, he said during the campaign that he was going to be able to settle this, and now he exaggerates. So let's just put the exaggeration aside. That he was going to have this settled in 48 hours.
Fair enough.
Yes, which is nonsense.
He did just settle Cambodia and Thailand by saying if you don't stop fighting, you can't trade with us.
Right, and but that doesn't work with Putin. and he settled the Pakistan-India thing too, and he wanted a Nobel Peace Prize for that. I think he's being naive, or he was.
So, Andrew, let me ask you this: what would you say to the folks who are, devotees of Andrew Tate or devotees of Tucker Carlson, who are sitting there and saying, no, you don't understand. Vladimir Putin is the best person ever?
Well, first, a lot of the lines that they use, Tucker Carlson, the rest of these guys, are straight out of Russian propaganda. You can get the stuff on the Russian official lines that they put through their propaganda mediums. They're not thinking for themselves when they talk this way to the public. A lot of the
and I just want to point out that you and I are both coming at this from the right.
Yes, exactly correct. I'm on right of center. The interesting thing is there was a study done by data scientists at the business school at George Washington University before COVID, about where the anti-vaccine messaging was coming from. 50% of it was coming from Russian intelligence. They're trying to drive up the death rates among our children and this is before COVID now, before all of this controversy. And Tucker Carlson was repeating the propaganda from the Russian intelligence service. I find it odd that we're being so naive where these guys are getting this stuff from. It's disturbing. I don't know how else to do it. I pointed out earlier, Putin in public ceremonies has brought back Russian fascists, Ivan Ilyin, from his remains from Switzerland to Moscow to be, and he was there at the ceremony. He quotes him on the air all the time. Look up the name online. Who is this guy? He's a Russian intellectual from the 1920s who hated the communists, but he worked in the Nazi Reich in Berlin in Goebbels' propaganda ministry. Why is his remains being moved from Switzerland back to Moscow? It's a little disturbing when you think about it.
Well, absolutely. But all of this is something that a lot of young men will not look at and just say, no, Putin is the man. Putin is the guy that is, looking out for us.
Well, they're wrong, and they are being misled. And I think some of them are just naive. They're not doing the research as to who this guy is. Hey, you read our book. You complete you finish our book and you conclude that Putin's great. You have to be living in a dream world.
All right, Andrew, thanks so much for the time today. Thanks so much for your book, and I recommend that everyone sit down, take the time to read it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brian.
Full Comment is a Postmedia podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx, theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Please hit the subscribe button wherever you listen, on Amazon, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and help us out by leaving us a rating or a review. Thanks for listening, and until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I promised you. Imagine yourself inside a Boeing 767 operated by Air Canada. It's July 1983, you're traveling between Montreal and Edmonton, and a couple hours into the flight, the comforting roar of its two jet engines suddenly stop, and most of the power cuts out.
Good evening. It was a metric mix-up. Air Canada has confirmed the plane that landed at Gimli, Manitoba last Saturday ran out of gas because of an error in metric conversion.
I regret to inform you that you're inside the Gimli glider, one of history's only incidents of a civilian airliner running out of gas in the middle of the sky. And this happened because someone didn't know how to properly measure out enough jet fuel. Now, I mentioned the Gimli glider only to note that systems of measure are not just numbers on a page. They're cultural objects. They might not be on par with language or religion, but they're ways of understanding the world around us. And if you screw with them, even with the best of intentions, you might get the occasional airliner falling out of the sky. Fortunately, in this instance, it miraculously worked out fine. The pilots in control of this particular Air Canada flight just happened to be two of the only people on Earth perfectly suited to safely bring down a crippled full-size airliner in the middle of Manitoba. One of them was an experienced glider pilot. The other one was a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who just happened to have served at a Manitoba airbase that was now directly underneath them. If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.